You want to know what's greater than a 400-mile race at Pocono? How about a whole weekend dedicated to the Tricky Triangle, and that even includes 2 cup races? I'm telling you, it's going to be a great weekend to catch up on some sleep. Okay, I'll stop with the Pocono bashing. After all, they have some pretty cool trophies if you win the race. One of the more forgotten races in Pocono's recent memory has to be the 2017 Pocono 400. Looking back on this race 3 years later, it was one of NASCAR's most critical races, and it ended up shaping the youth movement that we've seen today. So on this installment, we're going to retread back to the 2017 Pocono 400 and see what instances made it such an impactful race here in the 2020s. So the date is June 11th, 2017, and looking at the skies, this was a beautiful day in Pocono. I mean, you couldn't have scripted it any better. Sunny out, nice weather, great attendance, or at least good for Pocono standards. And then of course, if you're watching this from home, you had the national treasure himself, Mike Joy, calling the play-by-play for Fox, alongside 2 NASCAR Hall of Famers, Darrell Waltrip and Jeff Gordon. With 39 drivers at the ready, the cars were ready to take off and take on the advertised distance of 160 laps and 400 miles. Now, entering the race, there were 2 major storylines that helped shape the weekend and hype up the race. The obvious one was the NASCAR Cup Series debut of Bubba Wallace. At the time, his NASCAR Xfinity campaign was largely in doubt because Lido sponsored a majority of the first half of the races, and it didn't seem like they were going to gain enough sponsorship for the second half of the season. So, while he was performing really well for Roush Fenway Racing, it looked like his chances in Xfinity were pretty much done. So with all that became the injury of Eric Almirola, and as a result, Richard Petty decided to tab Bubba Wallace as the replacement driver for Pocono. To many, this was something that broke the race barrier, with Bubba Wallace becoming the first African-American driver to start a NASCAR Cup race since Wendell Scott. And knowing the challenges of the Tricky Triangle, this was going to be no easy task. But considering his journey to trucks and Xfinity, it was great to see Bubba Wallace finally make it to the grid. And now we are going to see what potential he had inside a Cup car. The second was the continued success of the 7-time champion, the league's torchbearer that was going to continue to break records left and right. Jimmie Johnson was coming off his historic win at Dover Raceway, one that tied him with Cale Yarborough for 6th on NASCAR's all-time wins list. And back in 2017, it seemed like the sky was the limit for Chad Knaus and this 48 crew. He was only 1 victory away from tying Darrell Waltrip and Bobby Allison, and Jeff Gordon and David Pearson were realistically in place. So now we come to Pocono, one of Jimmie Johnson's better tracks. You expected that this was going to be a monumental day once again for the 7-time champ. And then you had the crop of young drivers. Obviously Kyle Larson was having a breakout season. And then you have Chase Elliott, who was returning to the track where he led 51 laps in his first career Cup start. So as Darrell Waltrip said his infamous call and the green flag was waving, this infamous race was underway. And from the start, there was 1 car head and toe above the rest of the field. That being the red, white, and blue star-spangled banger of Kyle Busch. Now, believe it or not, coming into this race, the younger Busch was still scavenging for win number 1 on the season. I mean, it's not like he wasn't close. You had Phoenix, Richmond, Bristol, Talladega, and Charlotte where he was close to winning. But then, typically an untimely caution, penalty, or wreck would completely derail their hopes and left Kyle Busch winless 13 races into the season. But regardless, the 18 car had the speed, and if you wanted to win this race, you would have to likely go up and beat Kyle Busch yourself. So unsurprisingly, Kyle Busch ended up claiming the green and white checkered flag to win stage 1. Some of the other drivers scoring stage points were Kevin Harvick, Brad Keselowski, and Kyle Larson. Believe it or not, the almighty stage winner MTJ did not score stage points and had a very mediocre stage 1. So after a pit stop, Eric Jones resumed the lead, but once again Kyle Busch was able to get by him and completely sail away. Now while this was all happening, issues would plague the most popular driver of the sport, Dale Earnhardt Jr. As he entered turn 3 onto the front stretch, he tried shifting from 2nd to 4th gear, which would unfortunately damage the engine inside his race car. Now, this wasn't the first time that happened, as during Friday in practice, Dale Earnhardt Jr. suffered a very similar issue, and he ended up starting in the back because of this problem. And in both instances, this transmission issue ultimately damaged the engine, and Dale Jr. was done for the day. This was pretty much the race where Junior Nation had to accept that Dale Jr. sucked, and that the last 23 races before retirement would be to hell and back. Meanwhile, Jimmie Johnson was thoroughly climbing through the field, even while he was suffering heat issues inside the car. Through strategy and raw speed, the 48 had worked into the top 10, closing in on the end of Stage 2. Chad Knaus was getting the car better accustomed to the track, and with that, you expected Jimmie Johnson to be in contention. Win number 84 was on the horizon, and if he could do it, it would be the same place where Jeff Gordon won his 84th race back in 2011. More Jimmie Johnson greatness was on the horizon, right?
Won't matter. Wow. Jimmie Johnson slams the wall in Pocono.
Oh my.
That hope would be dashed just 5 laps until the end of the second stage. This violent crash stemmed from brake failure, and what made it worse was that Jimmie Johnson couldn't get the car steered properly to avoid such a violent hit. By not getting the car slowed down, Jimmie Johnson went into the outside wall at almost 200 miles per hour. When doing his interview for Fox Sports after the wreck, you could definitely tell he was shaken up. In the short term, it looked like Jimmie Johnson would dust it off and go to the next race. But in the long term, as I've theorized in the past, I think this wreck has definitely altered him physically and mentally. Since then, Jimmie Johnson has never been the same dominating driver, breaking records left and right. And after all, as of this recording, Jimmie Johnson has yet to win a race since this incident. If you want to point to the death of the 48 dynasty, just take an extra cold hard look at this incident. Ironically, Jamie McMurray also went ablaze, putting 2 Hendrick-powered Chevrolets out of the race. And because of that, became an all hell breaks loose 1-lap dash to end Stage 2. Chase Elliott would make a risky block on Brad Keselowski entering Turn 1. And watching this again, this was definitely one of the first signs that the conserve your stuff to the end of the race approach was pretty much dying. As stage racing continued, you would start seeing these younger drivers fight for every single position, every inch on the racetrack. And ultimately it angered some of the young drivers, including Brad Keselowski. Now, fortunately, this was before the whole William Byron thing which ensued 1 year later. Because I feel like under today's circumstances, Chase Elliott's Sun Energy SS would have been straight up dumped into the infield barrier. This type of aggression was a testament to the new era, and ultimately it was the young and talented Kyle Larson taking Stage 2. You know, this kid is something special. If he doesn't drop the N-word on an iRacing stream, he's probably going to win a couple championships. So with the start of Stage 3, Kyle Larson faded a little bit, and it looked like the Toyota teammates of Martin Truex Jr. and Kyle Busch were going to battle for the win. Really, the only challenge was from Brad Keselowski, as a Paul Wolfe strategy call kept him out on older tires, hoping for a caution. Unfortunately, the Blue Deuce would have to make a pit stop, handing the lead over to Kyle Busch, who had a 7-second lead over Martin Truex Jr. But then guess what happens? Not even a lap later after Brad Keselowski decided to pit, the caution comes out for Kasey Kahne. Much like Jimmie Johnson, this was another brake issue. But in this case, Kasey Kahne knew it was coming, so he immediately turned his car to the right, and this made his impact a lot less severe. Nonetheless, this continued another brutal stretch for Kasey Kahne. This was his 3rd straight crash on the season, and it would eventually be his 4th in 5 races. Kasey Kahne wouldn't be as fortunate 2 weeks later, slamming into the Pocono guardrail, and this is what I believe caused Kasey Kahne's downfall and to get a lot of his concussion issues. Thus, this would make an interesting strategy call for Kyle Busch and the 18 team. Now, in this situation, they didn't have a familiar face on top of the box. Adam Stevens was suspended after a wheel came off of the pedigree Toyota 1 weekend prior in Dover. The reasoning behind this was that this was a safety issue to NASCAR and amidst the whole lug nut controversies of 2017. So now, Ben Beshore, who wasn't used to crew chiefing very often, now had to make a call that would win Kyle Busch the race. It was definitely a stressful situation, but hopefully and all will, things would work out.
Road is open. Kyle Busch stays out.
Well, he's got a fast car, but I don't know about that.
To say things politely, Kyle Busch was completely screwed for the rest of the race. Everyone behind him had 4 fresh tires, with the exception of Eric Jones, playing a strategy call to take 2 tires and restart alongside Kyle Busch. This was the worst case scenario for Ben Beshore, and now Kyle Busch had his talent and a fast car alone to fend off the hungry pack behind him. Now, on the ensuing restart, Kyle Busch did pretty well. He fended off Erik Jones and was starting to pull away, but unfortunately behind him, some Ford Fusions on those 4 fresh tires were starting to eat into the 18's lead, and fast. One of those drivers was the second generation star Ryan Blaney, still looking for his first career NASCAR Cup victory. After all, the Blaney family was still looking for their first Cup victory, as Father Dave never won a Cup race in his career. You could tell the North Carolina native desperately wanted to win this race, as he went all the way down low trying to pass Kyle Busch for the lead. For the time being, Kyle Busch was able to successfully break the air and was able on no tires to fend off the bad fast 21. But as we got into single-digit laps to go, Ryan Blaney was able to get by Kyle Busch into turn 3, marking as yet another lost race for Kyle Busch. Kyle Busch wouldn't get his first win of the season until Pocono 2. This is a factual statement, unlike the YouTube commenters that like to call you out and then completely get the wrong race. So yeah, don't be this guy. So now Ryan Blaney, it looked like he was setting sail, but he would have one challenge left to getting his first victory. You got the hard-charging Busch Beer Ford of Kevin Harvick right on his tails. Now Kevin Harvick, believe it or not, with a storied career and successes, had yet to win a race at Pocono. You know he wanted to badly check this race off, and he was trying everything to close in the gap and get past Ryan Blaney to earn that checkered flag. With the intervals getting closer and closer, Ryan Blaney would have to be perfect to get his first victory, and perfect he would. Kevin Harvick just could not get that run to close in the gap and get the victory, and therefore the Robert Yates engine and the national treasure himself would guide him home.
And here they come. The winner at Pocono, Ryan Blaney for the Wood Brothers.
Wow. What a race.
Wow. I'm sorry you can't talk, bro, but I'm so proud of you today. Love you.
And just like that, Ryan Blaney was a winner in the NASCAR Cup Series. Within this new crop of youngsters, Ryan Blaney became the 4th driver to win his first race after Chris Buescher and Kyle Larson last season, and then Austin Dillon stretching out the fuel mileage a week before. And also beating the old and wise Kevin Harvick, 4 drivers in the top 10 were under the age of 30. You had Erik Jones coming home to a 3rd place finish, and then Kyle Larson and Chase Elliott finishing 7th and 8th respectively. And this is definitely at one of the more grueling tracks, one that takes experience to master the 3 turns at Pocono. Meanwhile, Bubba Wallace ultimately toughed out 400 miles to cross the line in 26th. Now, this wasn't necessarily the greatest race. I mean, he finished a lap down at Pocono. But in the end, he didn't do anything too stupid, and the King would bring him back for 3 more races, betterly improving his finish every race. So most certainly, when I look back on this race, I see this as one that helped kickstart NASCAR's youth movement and get into this new era. I mean, you just look at what ensued in the 2018 season. You had Matt Kenseth and Casey Kane get shoved out, and you had Alex Bowman, Erik Jones, William Byron, and then Bubba Wallace getting full-time rides. And then of course, a lot of these events kick-started into the 2018 Daytona 500, where youth would be on full display during that 500-mile race. I think as time progresses and we start to see these young drivers further succeed, we'll be able to look back onto this race and see this as a major youth shift in NASCAR's history. So anyways, this is NRF signing out, and just remember, life's a beach and then you drive.